In Campania, south of Rome, a group of veterans from either the 7th or the 10th Legion, which Caesar had settled around the town of Capua, were out hunting for stone with which to build their homes. Rather than paying for stone from the nearby quarries, these veterans proceeded to vandalize the ancient tombs of the area. With no reverence for the generations of men, women, and children buried there, these soldiers, as if laying siege to a town, hammered and chiseled away the rock, carting their collected stones off to their homesteads. In one particular tomb, however, the men discovered a collection of ancient vases, which they also carted off in order to sell. According to local legend, the tomb belonged to a Greek named Capys, the original founder of the town of Capua. Among the expensive vases, they discovered a bronze tablet bearing the following inscription: "Disturb the bones of Capys, and a man of Trojan stock will be murdered by his kindred, and later avenged at great cost to Italy." Caesar, like all Romans, considered himself descended from the Trojan soldiers who had fled to Italy in the aftermath of the Trojan War. By the time of Caesar's death, this tale had gained momentum, circulating so far as to reach the veterans in Gaul, as well as those in Hispania, where Caesar's personal secretary, Lucius Cornelius Balbus, who was serving as quaestor to Gaius Asinius Pollio, recorded the tale as part of Caesar's memoirs. As a condition of their settlement agreements with Caesar, the discharged legions were obligated to serve a further 4 years should they be summoned. And so, with increasing unrest in Italy in the wake of Caesar's assassination and funeral, Caesar's settled veterans itched to take up arms and avenge his death against the so-called liberators. Word was sent to Marcus Antonius that Caesar's veterans were prepared to march as soon as Antonius summoned them. In the town of Antium, Marcus Tullius Cicero arrived for a meeting with the key liberators, Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, and their consortium, in order to negotiate their next move. Having been hurried out of Rome by the imminent arrival of Gaius Octavius, and by the threat to their lives from the street crowds who followed the grandson of Gaius Marius, Cicero now looked to their security. Not only was Rome dangerous under the unofficial dictatorship of Marcus Antonius, but veterans from Italy all the way to Hispania were now anxious to purify their swords in liberator blood. With his wife, Portia Catonis, who was the daughter of the late Marcus Porcius Cato, and his mother Servilia Caepionis, who had been the long-time mistress of the late Julius Caesar, Marcus Junius Brutus listened carefully to his options. Through Servilia's efforts involving her back-channel connections and the support of Cicero, the Senate had come up with a solution for Brutus and Cassius. To keep them safely out of Italy until things calmed down, the Senate offered Brutus and Cassius an official posting as cura annani, or overseers of grain distribution, with special provisions which allowed them to travel to any port within the empire in order to administer Rome's vital grain imports. While providing Brutus and Cassius with a valid reason to remain outside Italy, this posting also gave them legal authority to travel the eastern provinces, where their fellow liberators, Gaius Trebonius and Lucius Tillius Cimber, served as proconsul of Asia and governor of Bithynia et Pontus, respectively. As had happened when Pompeius Magnus had been given a similar office, the grain distributors had the potential to become extremely popular with the people. It was likely at this same time that Brutus and Cassius chose to sponsor the Ludi Apollinaries in a further bid to win the popular support of the Roman people and eventually be recalled to the city. Also at this meeting was Marcus Favonius, a former general of Pompeius Magnus and close friend of Brutus. Favonius had had no knowledge of the plot to assassinate Caesar, considering that when Brutus and Cassius were initially screening their potential allies through casually loaded questions, Favonius had innocently answered that dictatorship, in its worst form, was still preferable to civil war. However, upon the death of Caesar, Favonius instantly threw his full support behind Brutus and the liberators. Marcus Favonius idolized the late Marcus Porcius Cato and did his best to emulate the strict Stoic by abrasively speaking his mind, boldly confronting those with whom he disagreed, and being generally unpleasant. Brutus, though he liked him well enough as a friend, regarded Favonius as simply rude, lacking the true spirit of Stoicism which had driven his uncle Cato. Marcus Favonius, the pretend Stoic, agreed with Cicero, who didn't trust Antonius a yard. But Marcus Junius Brutus wanted to go home. He viewed his stay outside the city as only temporary, until some kind of agreement could be reached with Antonius. Cicero argued that there was no agreement with Antonius forthcoming. From the day Caesar died, the consul Antonius had worked overtime to rid Rome of the liberators without being accused of launching another civil war. It was not safe for Brutus and Cassius to show their faces in Rome, and it was becoming less safe for them to remain in Italy, period. As the official head of the liberators, Brutus had become the bulwark of the Republic, representing its last defense against tyranny. And in Marcus Antonius, Rome had certainly acquired a new and far more ruthless tyrant. Eventually, Gaius Cassius Longinus arrived with his wife, Junia Tertia, who was the half-sister of Brutus. When Cicero repeated the Senate's offer for the latecomer's benefit, Cassius lost his temper. Grain distribution was an insult. Fuming with anger, Cassius then erupted into bitter complaints about all the wasted opportunities in the aftermath of Caesar's death, and about every perceived mistake. Much of his vitriolic hatred was directed at the absent Decimus Junius Brutus for not having better utilized his gladiator army on the Ides of March. But Cassius did agree with Cicero on one thing: the liberators needed to leave Italy. And so, Gaius Cassius Longinus announced that he would go to Greece, where he could begin mobilizing opposition to the consul Marcus Antonius. "And you?" asked Cicero of Brutus. "To Rome, if you agree," Brutus answered stubbornly. But Cicero did not agree. Exasperated by Brutus's refusal to comprehend his current predicament, the father of the Republic then launched into a litany of his own. He pointed fingers at each of them for not having included him in their designs, and for not heeding his advice to disallow Caesar a public funeral. Clearly they had underestimated Marcus Antonius, whom Cicero, had they brought him into the plot, would have advised also be assassinated. But what was done could not be undone. At the very least, Cicero argued, Brutus and Cassius should have immediately called an emergency meeting of the Senate instead of running like cowards to the top of Capitoline Hill. And Decimus Junius Brutus should have used his gladiator army to enforce the will of the liberators on the Senate before Marcus Antonius had time to act. At this, the outraged Servilia Caepiones shouted, "Upon my word, I have never heard the like." She was a descendant of Gaius Servilius Ahola, the man who had saved the Republic from the tyrant Spurius Maelius in 439 BC. Her son was descended from the very founder of the Republic, Lucius Junius Brutus. For Cicero to suggest that Brutus act like a tyrant himself and use gladiators to suborn the Senate into consent was an insult of the highest magnitude to a family whose republican sentiments were well founded in the blood of their ancestors. After this, Cicero held his tongue, realizing that Brutus had no designs on power and merely wanted to see the old republic restored. Unfortunately, in killing Caesar without a well-thought-out plan, all the liberators had done was to make room for the emergence of a far worse despot, Marcus Antonius. Finally, convincing Brutus that returning to Rome was not an option, the liberators began making secret plans to leave Italy before Marcus Antonius decided to mobilize Caesar's veteran legions against them. In their capacity as sponsors to the Ludi Apollinaries, Brutus, Portia, Servilia, and Marcus Favonius journeyed to Neapolis, modern-day Naples, at the end of June to audition a troupe of dancers for the festival. After hiring the troupe and sending them off to Rome, Brutus and his family did not return to Antium. Instead, they journeyed down the coast to the seaside town of Velia, where they rendezvoused with Cassius and Junia Tertia. Around the time Gaius Octavius released Caesar's bequest, shattering the liberators' opportunity to win popular support through the games of Apollo, Brutus and Cassius boarded a cargo ship with a few attendants and supporters. Although she begged desperately to go with Brutus, willing to share his fate as she had done since leaving Rome after the Ides of March, Brutus could not bring himself to subject his wife and stepson to whatever dangers lay ahead. And so, standing on the docks alongside Servilia Caepiones and Junia Tertia, Portia, with tears streaming down her cheeks, grasped the hand of her young son, Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus. Inconsolable, Portia watched as the ship carrying her husband and his companions grew small in the distance, eventually disappearing on the horizon of the Tyrrhenian Sea.